Chapter 7 The Feast Day Garment. Bruno Bettelheim said that as a young man he had been deeply impressed by Palestrina, the early 20th century romantic opera about the Italian Renaissance master of vocal polyphony. Like Wagner's Die Meistersinger before it and Hindemith's Mephister later. This musical legend by the German composer Hans Pfitzner honors the struggle of the artist against a society that would make him compromise his creative integrity. In Pfitzner's libretto, the world-weary Palestrina vows he will never write another note after hearing that the Council of Trent plans to ban all sacred music except Gregorian plainsong. But the spirits of 9 composers urge him to take up his pen to him by an angel. Palestrina composes his celebrated Missa Papina Archelli. All, including the Pope, hailed him for this masterpiece, a mass so sublime it rescues the art of contrapuntal music from the hostile forces within the church. Bettelheim said that what moved him was an aria in which Palestrina's son, Eno, sings of how his father's great fame accrued to him quietly and unobserved, enveloping him slowly over a lifetime. Like a feast day garment. In his 70s, Bettelheim confided to a friend that this was his private psychology. What he had secretly striven for all his life. Superscript 1 His enthusiasm for Eno's hymn to his father's humility was strikingly similar to Thomas Mann's delight in the same blessed lyrical moment as expressed in a 1918 appreciation of the opera, squared whether or not Bettelheim cried the passage. From the moment he attracted attention in 1943 with individual and mass behavior in extreme situations, he understood that the fabric for his own feast day garment would be his writing. By the end of 1950, hunting and pecking in his second language late into the night and on weekends, Bettelheim had produced at least 30 published articles, co-authored 11 more, seen extreme situations, reprinted 3 times, and turned out 2 books. Much of this writing was about the orthogenic school, or the treatment of emotionally disturbed children in general, such as closed institutions for children, which appeared in the bulletin of the Menninger Clinic. He also wrote about the Nuremberg trials and Palestine for politics, about anti-Semitism for commentary and the Journal of Abnormal and Social Psychology, and about the concentration camps for the Encyclopedia Britannica and Modern Review. He reviewed Alexander Miterlich's Doctors of Infamy and Marie Bonaparte's The Myths of War for the American Journal of Sociology, addressed somatic symptoms in superego formation for the American Journal of Orthopsychiatry, and found time, when asked by a colleague at the University of Chicago for a contribution to a collection on the teaching of the humanities, to set down his views on what students think about art. From the outset, Bettelheim wove his garment of prose with the constant and devoted help of skilled seamstresses, women he hired over 4 decades to rescue his manuscripts. Sometimes showed, but the rush of words that he probably lacked structure and concision, and he sometimes stumbled over the hurdles of English grammar and idioms, persisting for many years in writing times immemorial instead of from time immemorial. Throughout his life, he felt profoundly insecure about his style, which he knew was at best cumbersome. He feared that readers would laugh at his thinking, would reject his most personal and important offerings as not worth anything, and make him feel miserable. In the mid-1940s, he met a young woman who lived in Hyde Park named Ruth Soffer, an editor at the Encyclopedia Britannica who had been impressed by individual and mass behavior in extreme situations. She soon became his personal editor, shaping his drafts for more than 15 years under her married name of Ruth Marquis. Again and again, he gratefully credited her labors, writing in the informed heart that most of his ideas took their final form in print thanks to her. She not only edited, as many other of my publications, but she helped me plan it. From the title down to the last entry of the index. Marquis declined to share her recollections of this process, but others did describe it, among them Linnea Brandwein, who joined the orthogenic school staff as a typist in 1959 and would become an editorial needlewoman herself, remaining so even after she left the school in 1965. In the beginning, each day she arrived for work seemed like Christmas morning. Once again Santa had worked deep into the night and had left a gift by the side of her typewriter, usually a translucent green disc onto which he had dictated a first draft that needed transcribing, or a typey script she had made from earlier discs that now bore the bright blue traces of his fountain pen. A labyrinthine scroll posted with arrows and hieroglyphs that few besides Brandwein could decipher. When a substantial number of cleaned-up pages accumulated, Ruth Marquis would go to work on them. He trusted her absolutely, recalled Brandwein. Still, after the pages were retyped with Marquis' emendations, the blue ink would flow again, and the cycle would be repeated. Bettelheim was as receptive to outside editors as to those he employed. When, in 1948, he submitted the article on Palestine to Politics, Dwight MacDonald praised its skill and boldness in reproaching American Jews for their unwillingness to bring more displaced European Jews to the United States instead of working so hard for. But the editor complained that the piece was overwritten as typewritten pages. The author complied immediately, saying when he sent back the revised manuscript that he trusted MacDonald to make any additional minor changes without further consultation. In criticizing Bettelheim's original submission, MacDonald had said that for an academic journal it is perhaps and perhaps not necessary to state things as heavily and carefully as you do here. But for a general magazine, it is not necessary, and just loses the reader's attention. Bettelheim took this instruction seriously, understanding early on that he would more likely reach a large lay readership if he made sure to approach it with accessible, jargon-free prose. Bettelheim called the belief that the Jews and Arabs could live in peace a pipe dream. Whether that phrase was his, Marquis', or MacDonald's. The refugees' early letters showed him slipping comfortably, if sometimes not quite accurately, into the vernacular of his new tongue. He told James T. Farrell he felt like a heel for not replying to a letter sooner. He told MacDonald that earning a living kept him plenty busy. Superscript 1 that if the editor wanted him to review a certain book he would be glad to try my hand on it. Superscript 1 and that if Politics could come out more often than once a month it would be swell. Superscript 1 squared Bettelheim said that so many people must be telling MacDonald how good the magazine was that the editor probably thought he was just trying to jump on the bandwagon. Superscript 1 cubed in the spring of 1945. On a visit to New York to see his mother and sister, Bettelheim greatly enjoyed an evening with MacDonald, his wife, Nancy, and their politically engaged friends. Before long, the two men were beginning their letters Dear Bruno and Dear Dwight, and MacDonald was urging Bettelheim to rent a vacation cottage in Wellfleet, the Cape Cod community of writers and artists where the MacDonalds summered. Wellfleet proved too expensive, but, beginning in August 1949, Bruno and Trude and their two small girls did rent a cottage for several summers in the town of Truro, just up the road from the summer salons of Wellfleet. By the mid-1940s, Bettelheim was also on a Dear Jim basis with James T. Farrell, who had praised extreme situations and would seek Bettelheim's advice about his retarded son, John Stephen. Farrell's Lonergan trilogy, which Bettelheim admired, Superscript 1 was set in an Irish neighborhood not far from Hyde Park, but the Chicago writer now lived in the thick of literary Manhattan. The East is, but the Middle West, let's not talk about it, Bettelheim wrote to Ernst Fettern, who was living in Brussels after his liberation. You can thought his former campmates' views on life in the find many intellectuals, interesting and very lovable people. Only outside of the New York area things get pretty barren. And I mean barren. The University of Chicago is one of the many oases, but even here it is very difficult to remain in contact with things. In an earlier letter, Bettelheim had told Fettern that he liked his work at the orthogenic school, especially because university administrators did not interfere with him. Superscript 1 but now he said that his dream was finding a job in New York, and lamented that nobody had offered him one. Superscript 1, a group of New Yorkers did, however, offer him the opportunity to publish his first book. In 1944, Max Horkheimer, who had been director of Germany's Frankfurt Institute in the early 1930s as well as of its successor at Columbia University, joined the American Jewish Committee, where he established a Department of Scientific Research to produce a 5-volume series called Studies in Prejudice. The project sought to examine the impact on the individual and community of racial, religious, and ethnic prejudice in general, and of anti-Semitism in particular. Horkheimer recruited several of his Frankfurt colleagues as contributors, among them the sociologists Paul Matting, Leo Lowenthal, and, not least, Theodor Adorno, whose The Authoritarian Personality became the best-known book of the series. Bettelheim had first attracted the attention of these powerful leftist intellectuals with Extreme Situations, which would appear in Germany in the mid-1950s as the only essay by an outsider in a collection by Frankfurt School writers. Extreme Situations had also impressed the American Jewish Committee, to whose magazine, Commentary, Bettelheim soon would become an occasional contributor. He seemed to Horkheimer a good candidate to direct one of the studies. The two men discussed various investigations, among them comparing the prejudices of psychotics with those of a normal group of people with like intelligence, education, and family background, with the aim of finding out if the disintegrated personality was more prone to bigotry or less. But with the Allied victory in 1945, what began to intrigue them and their colleagues was the opportunity to measure how returning servicemen, who had just fought in a 4-year war against fascism and were now trying to find their way in the peacetime economy, felt about minorities. Superscript 1. About this time, a young teaching assistant named Morris Janowitz had begun work on a doctoral dissertation at the University of Chicago that involved interviews with former soldiers. Janowitz had been drawn to Chicago in part because he, too, had best lighted when Edward Shields, a leading light in the him to Bettelheim as just the man to help with the Horkheimer project. Bettelheim and Janowitz soon became good friends, with the young doctoral candidate taking on the major responsibility for the collection and analysis of data. They and their small staff conducted extensive open-ended interviews with a random sample of 150 Army veterans from the Chicago area, all of them white, Gentile former enlisted men. Superscript 1. Bettelheim and Janowitz excluded officers from their study, because their war experiences differed sharply from those of Willie and Joe. Though why and how this distinction might play a role in officers' attitudes toward minorities, Bettelheim and Janowitz did not make clear. They conceded that their decision skewed their sample to the lower and lower middle classes, but maintained that this was not unrealistic, since Nazism had shown that the most ardent anti-Semites came from such social ranks. Superscript 1. Such reasoning, along with other aspects of the survey, would lead to criticism that it was seriously flawed. Squared. Bettelheim and Janowitz's initial findings appeared in 1950, in The Dynamics of Prejudice, a psychological and sociological study of veterans, the second volume in the Studies in Prejudice series. They stress that their research showed that intolerance is always an outlet for hostility, but that it depends for its intensity on the degree of hostility accumulated, and on the strength of the controls which restrain it. Squared. Superscript 1. A conclusion some readers may have reached on their own without requiring so much buttressing. The book is heavy with appendixes, charts, and tables, social correlates of anti-Semitism, squared, quotations from the interviews I just couldn't stand being near a nigger, squared cubed, and more than a few passages suggesting that Dwight MacDonald's admonition about clear, jargon-free prose had not yet sunken. Eisler has pointed out that in those cases where tendencies rejected by the superego are displaced on members of an outgroup, the rationalizations for persecution of the outgroup induce the superego to join its energy to the its social impulses, squared. The co-authors planted Freud's flag with the book's epigraph. The limitation of aggression is the first, and perhaps the hardest sacrifice society demands from each individual. Squared. They set out to see if dynamic theories of human behavior could be applied to group interaction and concluded that interethnic hostility could be reduced if personalities were better integrated. Squared. This, in turn, required that individual tension be diminished. and one of the best ways to accomplish that was in the bedroom. According to psychoanalytic theory, instead of interpersonally gratifying sexual series maintains that anxiety is a direct or indirect consequence of inhibited sexuality. It may seem doubtful, in a society as complex as ours and with its countless sources of anxiety, whether all tensions can actually be discharged in sexual activity. But there seems little doubt that if two people enjoy a mutually gratifying sexual relationship, under normal circumstances the remaining tensions can be integrated with relatively greater ease. Squared even in 1950, before the Freudian grip on the man's collective psyche had begun to loosen. This was too much for some. One reviewer found incredible the author's blind acceptance of what was at best a sexual hypothesis that could hardly throw any further light on the whole problem of intolerance. Squared Bettelheim and Janowitz concluded from their data that intolerance was primarily a function of feelings of economic deprivation and downward social mobility. As an antidote, they prescribed an increased annual wage and an extension of Social Security and called for a change in the country's economic ethos, so that self-respect and respect for the community were not tied to the prevailing notion of upward mobility. The media-driven lust for ever larger cars and bigger television sets that was gathering momentum in the post-war boom. Squared on this score, Bettelheim practiced what he preached. Living modestly on his university salary, plus the occasional speaking fee, maintaining a deep commitment to his work at the orthogenic school, and always rejecting the idea of a lucrative private practice, which he could have established at any time. While the dynamics of prejudice was still in the making, Morris Janowitz introduced Bettelheim to an ambitious young Hyde Park neighbor, Jeremiah Kaplan, who in 1947 started a publishing house called the Free Press of Glencoe. Eager to build a list and impressed by what he was hearing about the orthogenic school, Kaplan signed up its principal to write a monograph on his work, and the indefatigable writer set about producing it. When Kaplan saw the final manuscript, he was astonished. He had expected a scientific work, a dry psychological study aimed at a limited, professional readership. What he had in his hands was the opposite, a richly anecdotal account in which Bettelheim took the reader on an unhurried tour of the school, pausing again and again to give detailed and often moving descriptions of the children and to explain his treatment philosophy. Bettelheim also supplied Kaplan with pictures taken by Myron Davis, a University of Chicago graduate and Life magazine war photographer who had spent 2 weeks capturing the children playing games on the dorm floors, planing boards in the woodworking shop, splashing in the bathtub, and from the pay. The book came out in 1950, but its impact proved far greater and gave a quantum boost to Bettelheim's reputation, not least because of its provocative title, Love is Not Enough. Modern living conditions, Bettelheim wrote in the introduction, have made it much more difficult for parents to create a setting in which both their own legitimate needs and the needs of their children can be satisfied with relative ease. That is why love alone is not enough and must be supplemented by deliberate efforts on the part of the parent. Cubed by way of an immediate example, he wrote that instead of keeping a child penned up so he wouldn't be able to burn himself on a hot stove, parents should fence off the stove itself, thus enlarging the space in which the child could play safely. Moreover, parents should campaign for the redesign of gas ranges so that toddlers would not be able to reach their knobs. Bettelheim argued that the alternative to such sensible approaches was too often the angry parental no, which convinced children that exploring their world was either dangerous or against mom and dad's wishes, or both. In preparing readers for what lay beyond the introduction, Bettelheim wrote that his observations about parents might sound unduly harsh but emphasized that they were drawn from his treatment of emotionally disturbed children and were meant to help conscientious mothers and fathers better understand and raise their normal children. Cubed superscript 1 Bettelheim drew heavily for Love is Not Enough on orthogenic school records, which he said elsewhere typically totaled some 700 single-spaced, typewritten pages for a child who had been at the school for 2 years. Cube Square. These thick dossiers included family histories, psychiatric evaluations, IQ scores, the results of Rorschach and thematic apperception tests, and reports on classroom progress. Transcripts of the counselor's dictation took up scores more pages, And to these descriptions and assessments of the children's behavior Bettelheim brought his considerable storytelling skills, drawing pseudonymous sketches of the unhappy children in his care. Tales of Richard, who believed that animals protected him and who had to talk to his teddy bear in the morning before he could talk to people. Cube of Felix, who felt that, to be loyal to his father, who had died when the boy was very young, he must make.
What published criticism there was of the books surfaced mainly in sure never to acquire an education as good as his stepfather's superscript 3-4 of Emily, who after some time at the school could boast whenever she went to the toilet psychological snapshots and all else in the book in a tone of psychoanalytic sweet reasonableness. The disarming voice at once all-knowing it is common knowledge that the difficulties of almost all emotionally disturbed children have originated in the relationship to a parent. Superscript 3-6 and modest. We are not always a match for our tasks, because unfortunately we made mistakes. Superscript 3-7. In soothing and reassuring prose, he wrote about the children's first encounter with the school, their dreams, their efforts to learn in the classroom, their eating and bathroom habits, and about their ventures into the immediate neighborhood. In the final chapter, he took the reader into the dorms at bedtime as he tucked in Jack, who dreaded falling asleep because he feared he might not be alive in the morning. Superscript 3-8 and Anne, who thought babies came out of penises and had a long history of bedwetting and night terrors. Superscript 3 and 11-year-old Ronnie, who, with a severely depressed mother who had contemplated killing both herself and her children, now worried that once he fell asleep he might kill. 4 degrees with the reader entranced, Bettelheim quietly turned out the light and tiptoed from the room. I would like to go on with my story of the school, he wrote in this nocturne, but in a manner of speaking it is past midnight and all the children are asleep. For superscript 1 Bettelheim noted his debts to Emmy Sylvester, his friend for Treadle, and the work of August. They are porn, among others. And in footnotes on many pages he credited the efforts of individual counselors, calling each a participant Obi Serbert, a concept developed in the 1930s by Harry Stat Sullivan, who believed that the therapist is inextricably bound up in the information he draws from his patient. He also acknowledged Ruth Soffer's untiring help in editing the book, the first of 7 she would make whole for him. Jeremiah Kaplan told me that these manuscripts arrived at the Free Press needing little further editing. In that respect, Bettelheim may have been the best author I ever published. Bettelheim planned 3 books about the school, Foursquared inspired in part by the example of his friend Jim Farrell's ambitious Lonergan trilogy. In 1955, the Free Press published the second, Truants from Life, the rehabilitation of emotionally disturbed children. Unlike Love Is Not Enough, which was full of vignettes and anecdotes, brief descriptions of the behavior and treatment of numerous residents, this volume offered for extensive case histories that Bettelheim said fairly represented the school's 40 patients. For superscript 3 there was Paul, who entered after 10.5 years in other institutions, where he had demonstrated both homicidal and suicidal tendencies. Mary, who had a history of petty theft and of hurting a playmate with a knife. John, who, as a result of the thrush mouth infection he had developed in the days after his birth, and the delinquent Harry, a constant truant who first ran away from home at age 4 and who often spent his days riding street cars or the L trains, sitting in movie theaters, and occasionally visiting taverns, where patrons rewarded his childish antics with drinks or gifts. 44 To tell these stories, Bettelheim again mined the reams of dictation supplied by his mostly female staff, in one case several thousand pages, type single-spaced 45, and again leaned on the organizing and editing skills of Ruth Soffer Marquis, as well as 3 other women. 46 He devoted 428 of the book's 511 pages to the histories, and those space limitations makes it impossible to summarize them fully. The common pattern is clear. All 4 portraits of the children's parents or foster parents are unflattering. Paul's father was an immature man who showed no interest in his son. The boy's mother was a gold digger whose in-laws called her that witch and who rejected her son by dumping him in one institution after another. 47 Mary's parents had both died by the time she was 3 and a half. leaving her to be raised by a cruel, rejecting aunt who could not deal with her wildness and who constantly compared her actions with the good behavior of her own two children. John's mother and father demonstrated an emotional inability to deal with his physical and mental abnormalities, not only before they put him in the school but throughout his stay there. 48 Harry's father was weak and an alcoholic. When drunk, he often abused the boy, who himself demonstrated great hostility at an early age. When he frustrated his mother's desire to have a model son, punished him severely and called him the meanest child in the world. For each child was extremely difficult to handle, especially in his or her first months at the school. And Bentham and his staff showed heroic and patient dedication in dealing with this behavior. Paul grew enormously fat from overeating and frequently sucked his thumb, smacked his lips, and made loud clucking noises with his tongue. He said he was a crazy killer who didn't want to live himself and threw fearsome tantrums, during which he destroyed toys and even set fires, first to his own pajamas and then to a pile belonging to his doormates. 5 degrees. Mary screamed constantly, her rages pushing her caretakers to the emotional edge. But, Bentham said, they never left her to cry alone, and never became so upset or frustrated that they lost touch with her. 5 Superscript 1 John was literally a foul child, homely, disheveled, often smeared with spittle, mucus, and dirt, but at almost every meal. When he seems least likable, so appealing dark eyes as a way of maintaining her for him. Child who had thrown the carving knife at Gail Schulenberger when she had taken her boys to the basement kitchen for an evening snack. At this, Bentham wrote, the other boys turned on him in a fury, and he grew paralyzed for a moment. But before he had time to turn and run, Schulenberger went up to him, took his hand and held it firmly. Then she told Harry and the other boys that no one was to blame but herself. She said she knew Harry could not control his temper and so she should not have taken him to a place where there were knives flying around, or have let him out of her sight for even a minute. 5 Superscript 3 All 4 children made steady progress at the school, and each one left much better able to cope with life. Bentham reported that a year after Paul departed he graduated from high school 73rd in a class of 305 and was making a good adjustment in the outside world. Mary, too, did well academically after she left, and though she initially had to deal with a rigid foster mother, she eventually moved to a more accepting home, where she felt happy, well-liked and understood. 54 John left the school vastly improved. 55 returned to live with his parents, and in time attended a well-known private school with very high academic standards. 56 Harry chose to live with his mother. When she continued to criticize him, he moved in with his father. His life remained difficult, but he received good grades in high school and despite all hardships, was able to turn his life toward success. 57 In the pages of Truths from Life, the 4 graduates all endorsed Bentham and his methods. He wrote that he asked Harry to talk about himself and his experience at the school at his farewell party, but instead the boy chose to talk mostly about Dr. B, whom he described as a very cautious man who did not want anybody to hurt himself or others. 58 Paul, during a return visit to the school, told the director that it was the little things and time that had helped him. In concluding Paul's case, Bentham wrote that he had told him that Little Things and Time would make an ideal title for his history. He said Paul replied, good title, and add understanding and patience. 5 When Mary, too, returned to the school for a visit, Bentham said he asked her if they had done anything wrong in treating her. She said that she had not liked it when the counselors had, in fact, ignored her occasionally during her screaming spells, but that was her only complaint. Although I encouraged her and told her how much I wanted to know what we did wrong, she could not think of any other mistakes we had made in handling her. He then asked her if he should continue conducting the school as he had when she was a resident, and added that she sees the main thing all 4 case histories had in common, which made each so compelling, was Bentham's gift for storytelling, which riveted the reader from the moment each broken child entered the school until he or she emerged much repaired. The profiles in Truths from Life, wrote one reviewer, read as fluently as a good novel. 6 Superscript 1 Bentham's friend and model Jim Farrell agreed, in assessing the book for the New York Times Book Review. He called it a brilliant study and said that the case histories made the children become as real as characters in a good novel. 6 squared. By the 1980s, fiction is just what such histories had come to be regarded as by most of the therapeutic profession, which had ceased to consider them at all evidentiary but more a literary form, a heuristic series of exemplars of the author's ideas. 6 superscript 3. But in the 1950s, most psychotherapists still regarded case studies as science, as they had since the histories of anecdote and lore entered the Freudian canon at the turn of the century. Still, the profession generally believed that theory should come first, a position Bentham rejected. While working on Truants from Life, he wrote to his friend David Rappaport, a psychologist on the staff of the Austin Riggs Center in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, saying that he felt hemmed in by an overgrowth of psychoanalytic theorizing on infantile development and schizophrenia, which for years led him to misunderstand the meaning of observations. 64. He argued that case histories should come first, that the time had come to re-examine and perhaps replace some worn-out theoretical concepts with some better ones based on clinical experience. He did not specify in the letter what theories had led him to misunderstand his observations, or even what those observations were, nor did he indicate which worn-out theoretical concepts needed replacement. Sometimes he sent out contrary messages about psychoanalysis. Though he often said that it was an art and not a science, and likened himself to a poet, he wrote that he had striven for scientific honesty in setting down the histories in Truants from Life, in part as a way of guarding against the hazard of narcissistic pride in having been the person best able to help the children. 65. After Love Is Not Enough came out in 1950, Bentham told Dwight MacDonald that he surely would appreciate it if he would review it, ideally for partisan review. 66. MacDonald wrote a review, though that never saw publication anywhere. In the manuscript, he conceded that Bentham had some important things to say, but questioned whether, as the book implied, the Freudian Mountie always got his man. The many fascinating stories in the book invariably have happy endings. The child is helped, but surely must who just didn't respond to treatment, or else shifted their symptoms to new hideouts as the Mounties closed in. It would be refreshing to hear about the big ones that got away, and perhaps instructive as well. As a success story, Love Is Not Enough is an impressive and instructive book in the modern scientific tradition, in whose bright lexicon there is no such word as failure. It might have been something even more useful if its author had risen above, or sunk below, the foible of omnipotence. 67. That was not Bentham's style. In a long footnote at the end of Love Is Not Enough, he reported that in the 5 years he had run the school 40 children had graduated and that nearly all of them had reached their grade level in academic achievement and were now doing well in public or private school. He conceded that it was too soon to make any long-term guarantees about these successes, noting that lack of funds had made it impossible for him to conduct any systematic follow-up study. From a casual one, however, it appeared that better than 80% of our former students have been doing very well during the years since they left the school. Sometimes far better than we'd dare to expect in view of the severity of their initial difficulties. 68. He did not explain how he made his casual study or how he had calculated the 80% figure, nor did he describe, even using pseudonyms, the life being lived by any of the 32 graduates who were now doing so well, or indicate what their severe problems had been when they came to the school. By the time Truants from Life came out in 1955, 5 years after the first book, the follow-up study of former residents had still not been undertaken, but money no longer seemed the main obstacle. Now Bentham argued that statistical analysis was not sufficiently refined to shed much light on the questions of treatment success. 6. He also wrote that, because the school's children depended so on others to take over their care after they left, forecasts are virtually impossible. None of these obstacles discouraged him from making broad claims of success based on his subjective impressions, which he asked his readers to accept. He reported that, from 1948 to 1953, 31 children who had been at the school more than 12 months had left. He said to show no lasting improvement. 3 were somewhat improved, 11 were much improved, and 15 were fully rehabilitated. 7 degrees. The systematic Long-term follow-up study of the children at the orthogenic school would not begin until the late 1980s, some 15 years after Bettelheim retired as director. D. Patrick Zimmerman, coordinator of research at the school, started the investigation by organizations. It shows that Bettelheim often buttressed his case. Between 1944 and 1949, the first 5 years he ran the school, 80 children left, not 40. As he had written in Love Is Not Enough. 32 children did leave the school between 1948 and 1953, only one more than he stated in Truants from Life, but the Zimmerman database indicates that Bettelheim's claim that half were fully rehabilitated and 11 more much improved is not true. Using each child's records, Zimmerman employed the Timber-Long level of function scales to gauge how well the resident was coping with life at the time he or she left Bettelheim's care. This measure assesses the child in 3 categories: how he interacts with his peers, how he relates to his parents, and how he manages in school or in a job, and rates him good, fair, or poor in each. None of the 32 children received 3 good ratings. 4 received 2, and 2 received 1. The remaining 26 ranged from fair to poor. Tom Wallace Leon, who attended the orthogenic school from age 8 to age 20 and wrote a novel about his experience called The Pelican, and after likened Bettelheim to Big Jewel, the crack shooter from Chicago in Guys and Dolls who insists on using his own dice. These, it turns out, are blank, leading Nathan Detroit to ask Big Jewel how he knows he has just rolled the winning 7. The Windy City Gambler tells him not to worry, he knows just where the spots are. Leon, who after leaving the school in 1963 would eventually graduate from the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism and become a reporter, saw the case histories in Bettelheim's books as big brute-nosed dice, all white bones that allowed the director to come up the winner on every thrown. Moreover, the dice were loaded even before he scooped them up. Some counselors, like Gail Schulenberger, worked hard on their dictation and made a point of doing it, as Bettelheim wanted, at the end of each day, when the children's behavior and their reactions to it were fresh in their minds. But many were exhausted or finally getting the dorms quiet at night and often let the burdensome task slide for a week or more, by which time the complex psychological interactions with their charges were inevitably blurred. Whether the dictation arrived on time or not, it almost always came from a counselor who was young and inexperienced, or who, if she had been at the school for a while, had received all her training from Bettelheim. Regardless of the quality and accuracy of the dictation, Bettelheim scrambled it in his hat and out rolled the steady stream of optimistic case histories, dramatic, readable stories of troubled children, hopeless cases he said everyone else had given up on 7 superscript 1 but who, in most instances, had made rest. Most counselors did not see how Bettelheim had relished. Patty Pickett, for one, wished he had consulted her first. It wasn't exactly how I had dictated it, she told me. I felt like saying, you don't have to exaggerate, Dr. B. It was dramatic enough. Ann Morissette, who was a counselor at the school for 18 months in the late 1940s, felt that Bettelheim carefully chose cases to make the school look good and sometimes made the reports sound better than they really were. In Truants from Life, Bettelheim wrote that all 4 case histories were read by all staff members who in some major capacity worked with the child described. 7 superscript 2. In fact, several of the counselors had left the school by the time the manuscript was in preparation, and at least one of them, Betty Lou Pingree, who had worked with John, said she read the history for the first time only after the book was published. Her recollection, however, was that it was a fair reflection of the boys' time at the school. Other former counselors also said Bettelheim was true to their dictation. Karen Carlson said she dictated copious notes on the child Bettelheim called Marcia and described at length in The Empty Fortress, his 3rd book about the school, and the one that focused on autism. Carlson said that after Bettelheim wrote up that case history he showed it to her and was open to corrections of facts as well as to challenges of some interpretations that he had made. She said Bettelheim was skeptical when she told him that Marcia had used the pronoun I. When Carlson insisted that this was true, he included it in the case history. 7 superscript 3. It would be helpful, of course, to compare the dictation and other raw material on several former patients with Bettelheim's use of it in his books, but the information is part of personal files that the orthogenic school holds in strict confidentiality. This limitation and the absence so far of any long-term follow-up studies produce a singular irony when trying to gauge the efficacy of Bedelham's work, for the most part. His claims can only be assessed through interviews with former residents and their families and the occasional public statement, which produce just the sort of anecdotal evidence that critics often accused Bedelham of using to make his cases. Of the 4 residents Bedelham described in Truants from Life, only Paul was available for an interview. He was almost 60 years old when I talked to him, a successful Chicago businessman and husband and father living in one of the city's prosperous northern suburbs. The boy of 10 when he entered the orthogenic school in 1946, he recalled Bedelham working long hours. I saw him exhausted, I saw him unhappy, but when I found things too tough or I wanted something special, I would go to him and he always seemed to know what to do. When I had an anxiety attack at bedtime, he'd go me downstairs and say, sit on the couch, his hands folded, and say, what were you thinking, what frightened you? He said Bedelham combined this ability to empathize with a strong sense of authority that never fazed him if you liked or disliked his decisions. There was no appeal. In the beginning, Paul found some Bedelham's policies confusing. He wondered why, given the director's strictness, the children who ran away were almost never punished. Only after he had been at the school for a while did he come to understand that Bedelham and the staff were trying to show him and the other residents that truancy was for some logical reaction to their first weeks at the school, that it was nothing to be ashamed of, and that they would always be welcomed back with relief and affection. Paul also was struck by the explanation given when protective gates went up on the windows of the upper floors. The school installed these bars to keep the children from falling out, but many saw them as imprisoning. To counter this fear, Bedelham explained that the gates were there to keep people from getting in. This was reassuring, because many of us suffered from what you could call the Borky-man syndrome. Paul's primary counselor was Gail Schulenberger. As a child, she had feared losing her parents and being placed in an orphanage, so she quickly identified with her young charge. But she also felt that Bedelham should not have admitted him, that he was too entrenched in his disturbance and infantile in his reactions ever to get well. 74 Once he was admitted, however, Sheila bored day and night to guide him toward integration. And as he began to improve, found him the most thrilling child to work with. 75 Paul told me that at the time he did not really know what a mother was, but that, looking back on Schulenberger's efforts, it is clear that she was his surrogate mother. The stability that she and Bedelham instituted at the school finally engulfed me. Paul stayed for 4 years. Bedelham wanted to keep him longer, but the residents would eventually be able to stay beyond age 20. In 1950 the upper age limit was 14. Paul was terrified by the prospect of leaving the place that had costed him more than any other. In the weeks before his departure, he tried to inhale everything the school had to offer, primarily food. He gained 10 pounds in his last month, Bedelham wrote, and left 44 pounds overweight. 76 In the next few years, Paul struggled, with mixed results, to adapt in 2 foster homes, and also tried, without success, to establish a relationship with his mother. He continued studies for a while at the Art Institute of Chicago, developing the gift for painting that he had demonstrated with his drawings at the orthogenic school by his caseworker, his foster parents, who in differing degrees regarded painting as sissified and an obstacle to his efforts to become a well-balanced, conventional citizen. He never resumed painting. It was one of those crossroads of life decisions, he said, sounding wistful. After high school, Paul spent 2 years at Shimmer, a small liberal arts college associated with the University of Chicago, and then finished his undergraduate work at the university itself, concentrating in science and math. He worked in engineering sales and at other jobs until the late 1960s, when his father-in-law died and he took over the family business. He continues to run the company. Here I am, some 40 years down the road, for all intents and purposes a functioning adult. But I've had lots of crises in my life, Paul told me. When I face a crisis, I don't see myself in quicksand or drowning or hiding underneath a rock. I see myself on a tightrope, trying to get from point A to point B. I don't really get frightened by the abyss, because if I have doubts about my footing, I concentrate on the bar in my hand that keeps me balanced until I have the confidence to move forward to get to that safe point. That balancing bar is the influence that Dr. V gave me. What makes up that balancing bar is every moment with him. One of his techniques was a simple mother's technique, to be in the room when you needed him. F. Howell Wright, the head of pediatrics at the University of Chicago, who treated the children's medical needs throughout Bethlehem's 3 decades at the school, said there is no question that the director was dedicated to creating a special therapeutic atmosphere for children like Paul. But he also felt that quite a few of the patients did not need such radical treatment and never should have been removed from their families in the first place. In Wright's view, one such case was Bertram Collar. As a child, Bert Collar was, in his own words, a pain in the ass to live with. The boy who got into constant fights with his parents and did poorly in school. His father, Jonas Robert, was a law partner of Edward Levi, a member of Chicago's German-Jewish elite and a gifted teacher who would become dean of Chicago's law school and, in 1968, president of the university. After Roy Brinker and George Moore, prominent Chicago psychoanalysts, recommended the orthogenic school for Bert, Levi checked it out for the Collar family. Bethlem was delighted to admit someone so well-connected, Collar told me. He was buying into good, high-class German stock, which was important to him. The new resident's grandfather ran a men's clothing company called Kuppenheimers, and Bethlem gray dark suits he favored. Collar entered age 10 and a half, and stayed until he was 17, moving on to achieve a success Bethlem frequently pointed to as a measure of the school's effectiveness. After getting his bachelor's degree at the University of Chicago, Collar earned a doctorate at Harvard and eventually became, like Bethlem himself, a professor in the departments of education, psychology, and psychiatry at Chicago. Along the way, he spent periods at the orthogenic school as a counselor, associate director, and, in the early 1970s, as director for several months when Bethlem was on leave. Recalling his years as a resident, Collar said it was clear to him from the outset that Bruno knew who I was and cared what happened to me, that his singular genius was in creating an envelope around the children that made them feel safe. What D.W. Winnicott called a holding environment. 77 Collar said that there were some extremely disturbed children in the dorms, but he agreed with Howell Wright that many others were just basically delinquent kids as he was, children who were getting along with their families. Bruno was always loose with his diagnoses. That's how he could make great success claims. Though about 220 residents of all kinds passed through the school while Bethlem was director between 1944 and 1973-78 in the mid-1960s. He wrote that several hundred schizophrenic children, all with an unremitting fear for their lives, had been in his care since 1944. William Love, a counselor in the late 1940s who quickly came to regard Bethlem as a bullying cult leader and his women counselors as a slavish Roman cohort, said none of the children seemed to him to be nearly as disturbed as the director proclaimed them to be at staff meetings and in his writings. It amazed me, Blood wrote, that Bethlem, a man from another culture, could look at the same child as I and see a schizophrenic while I saw another rambunctious American kid. What did a 40-year-old Viennese intellectual really know about the inner or outer, for that matter, life of a 10-year-old West Side Chicago Irish kid who had no one to care for him? 8 degrees 20 years after Blood worked at the school, David M.C. Tourette, while researching a profile of the director for the New York Times Magazine 8 Superscript 1, he told me that he could not believe, when he talked to some of the children, that there was anything wrong with them. I couldn't understand why they were there. One reason was that Bethlem planned it that way. Nina Helstein, the teacher at the school during the brief period Bert Collar ran it, recalled a staff meeting just before he assumed control, at which Bethlem told him that he should make sure to admit some children that he knew were not too disturbed. Helstein told me that Bethlem said, the way to do that is to show some successes. As a teenager at the school during these final years of Bethlem's tenure, the institution was, for the most part, a dumping ground for young people who were different in some way or, for whatever reason, didn't match their parents' expectations. Many parents were given bad advice by experts and did not know that there were alternatives. Some of the young people needed to be in special classes for gifted youth or for those with disabilities in specific areas. Some needed treatment for medical problems. To label all of these people as psychotic, as Beddoe repeatedly called us, was a truly evil act. It also put him in a position to inflate his success rate by curing people who were not actually psychotic in the first place. 8 Superscript to Beddoe's penchant for making severe diagnoses was cruel and self-serving but not unique. In a summary of the literature on childhood mental pathology, Margaret Fish and Edward R. Ribot found that by the 1950s such stark assessments were widespread in the United States and that many disturbed children, whom one would consider today to have only borderline or even no psychotic symptoms, were lumped together in an ill-defined category of childhood psychosis. 8 Superscript 3 Most reviewers in the lay press were as dazzled as James T. Farrell by Beddoe's optimistic accounts in his books about the school. The Chicago Sun-Times called Love Is Not Enough a book no intelligent parent should miss, stating that Beddoe and his associates have been able to discover just where many kids go wrong in raising their youngsters. 84 The Chicago Tribune said the author told a fascinating story. 85 The View also expressed in the New York Times Book Review. 86 The San Francisco Chronicle called the book important and challenging for all who are concerned about the mental health and welfare of children. 87 The sociologist David Reisman, whose influential study of the changing American character, The Lonely Crowd, also came out in 1950, praised his University of Chicago colleague in The Nation, writing that the fabulously great efforts put in by those who work with the more extremely disturbed constitute, among other things, a political protest of great promise for the future. 88 Several months later, Beddoe lauded The Lonely Crowd in the University of Chicago magazine. 8 What published criticism there was of the books surfaced mainly in professional journals and received little attention. Though conceding that Love Is Not Enough represented a pioneering effort, Norman V. Lowry, Beddoe's counterpart at Hawthorne Cedar Knolls, a leading residential treatment center for children in New York's Westchester County, wondered just what kind of training, if any, orthogenic school counselors received. He also faulted Beddoe for not making clear just how he implemented Beddoe's belief that consequent contention that the behavior and treatment of troubled children necessarily carried a useful message for parents trying to raise their average kids. Superscript 1 Teresa Benedict called Love Is Not Enough a brilliant attempt to describe treatment at the school, but the Hungarian-born psychoanalyst, a member of the Berlin Institute who had come to Chicago in the 1930s, felt, like Lowry, that Beddoe's explanations of his methods fell short, and she went so far as to warn mothers not to use the book as a guide for rearing their children because the vignettes might prove too upsetting. Superscript to Donald W. Fisk, in his favorable Chicago Tribune review of Love Is Not Enough, had observed that the patience, fortitude and ingenuity of the whole staff as described by Dr. Beddoe are almost beyond belief. Most likely he meant this without skepticism. But some professionals did find the confident prose and smooth anecdotes a little too neat. One pointed out, correctly, that the book was full of passages that claimed to know what the children were thinking and asked just how Beddoe and his counselors could be so certain what the children wondered and felt in given situations. Beddoe wrote that one boy picked up a sandwich at his first meal, bit into it and then put it down. Provocatively, he picked up another one, took a little bite, and put it down. And this he continued with another and another until he had bitten into 8 altogether. By then he began to wonder if we might not, contrary to his expectations, be more interested in allowing him the freedom to behave in line with his emotional need to waste food than we were saving food or in enforcing good manners at the table. Superscript 3 That is a remarkable insight, the critic suggested, for an emotionally disturbed child to have at his first meal in a strange new institution. For by the mid-1950s, Beddoe had made a good start at weaving his Palestrinian feast day garment of fame. Many who saw it from a distance were impressed by its color and what seemed its fine stitching, but those who saw the fabric up close knew the robe served partly as camouflage. The counselors liked their cameo roles as participant observers in Love Is Not Enough and Truants from Life, and relish the cachet of being associated in print with their charismatic employer therapist, whose self-propelled reputation for curing was beginning to spread well beyond Hyde Park. But even at the time, and certainly later, many recognized that he prettified life at the school, that he rarely captured what it really was like in the emotional trenches with the children day after day, or revealed the traumatic interactions of the staff meetings, where psyches quivered and tears flowed regularly in the face of his Nazi-Socratic method. This reality roiled the pages of the books. Something soon added to the school by the sweetness and light of Beethoven's seductive prose. One of them was Dennis Duganska, the Wisconsin farm boy who was a counselor and teacher in the 1960s and went on to teach psychology at Northeastern Illinois University in Chicago. After I was at the school for a while, I saw that Love Is Not Enough was full of nice stories, Duganska told me. But Driveby left out the dark side of running a place like the orthogenic school. You could not construct an institution out of his book. There was no sense of what happened when the children acted out, no sense of the repercussions and the punishment,